Hi, everyone. Today's lecture is on disasters, and I'm going to focus on the natural and social disaster of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. The kind of the sub-theme of the lecture is to explain uh, an instance of environmental racism and put it within its historical context in relation to this particular city. And I'm drawing some of this lecture from an essay from Robert Brim from Sociology as a life or death issue, in case you want to read about it some more. So Brim argues that Hurricane Katrina was a social disaster, and he suggests that while the hurricane itself was natural, the outcome was fully social and, more importantly, avoidable. To some extent, however, the force of the hurricane itself was human-caused insofar as global warming has intensified the strength and frequency of hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when we look at New Orleans geographically, most of the city, actually all the city, lies below sea level and is situated on wetlands created from thousands of years of flooding from the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River annually floods and deposited silt. And the whole area is really the Mississippi Delta. So it's all basically sand and clay. It's not stable ground. And it's also not a great place to build a city, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, the city is also coastal, so it's not far from the ocean. In fact, it is getting closer and closer and closer to the ocean because of the erosion of the coastal wetlands, which I'll talk about in a second. So the city is below sea level. It's surrounded by the Mississippi Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. Now, this area also receives about 5 feet of rain annually. And every year, as I mentioned, the Mississippi floods, but the floodwater is held back by a very extensive levee and canal system that diverts water and silt to the lake. Okay, so silt that would normally be distributed along the land from the flooding prior to the levees is being directed to the lake. And some of that silt traditionally would have flown into the Gulf of Mexico, which would have built up the coastal land around the Gulf. So if you look at a map, like go Google Earth or something, and look at where New Orleans is, you'll see that to the south of New Orleans, there's a pretty extensive delta, there's pretty extensive wetlands and silt area. So that's been diminished over time because that silt just doesn't get all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi. So the levees and the canal systems also offer protection from storm surges. Okay, so they're designed to divert water away from the city and to keep the city as dry as possible, either because of flooding from the Mississippi or because of storm surges due to tidal storms. So even though the site of New Orleans is a bad place to build a city, it has a very strategic advantage, mostly historically. So the French, who first settled in that area, built a fort at New Orleans in order to control access to the inner part of the continent. So the Mississippi River is one of the largest rivers in the world. If you want, especially in the 16th and 17th century, if you wanted to control trade, you wanted to control the Mississippi. By having a fort at the mouth of the Mississippi, no one could sail a ship up there without the French blowing their ships to smithereens. So if the French controlled the Mississippi, it means they controlled the fur trade for much of continental North America. So French colonists established the city in 1718. Originally, it was very cosmopolitan at the time. So there's French Canadians, Germans, West African slaves, some free African Americans, and Native Americans, which I believe at that area would be Seminole and Choctaw. They all lived there, not necessarily harmoniously, but intermarriage was quite common in this French territory, which created a new ethnic group, the Louisiana Creole. Now, the French sold Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase to the U.S. in 1803. There's just a historical picture of the city on the geography. So the Louisiana Purchase, you could see, was quite extensive. So it increased the size of the U.S. by a third, basically. The U.S. had yet to conquer these areas. Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, blah, blah, blah. So with the Louisiana Purchase, we see a change in the race dynamics of New Orleans. And incidentally, this line here is the Mississippi River, so you could see how far the Mississippi River goes up. It goes all the way up, like from Minnesota, I think. Anyway, so between 1810 and 1860, white Americans flocked to New Orleans. Okay, so from the U.S. states here, they flocked to New Orleans, and the number of white residents increased from 37% to 85%. So this is just a historical chart of population. Native Americans were rarely counted in population trends. They're not included in these numbers. But we see around 1810, about 37% of the population of New Orleans was white, roughly 84-85% or so were of African descent. The number of residents of African descent decreased to about 15% in only 50 years. Okay, so what happened is many of the many of the new white residents built their homes uphill, so they stayed out of the lower lying lands in the city. Those lands were already occupied by mostly African American and Creole people, and New Orleans became a segregated city. Now, while there was racialized inequality prior to the Louisiana Purchase, there was definitely slavery. The color line was definitely less rigid, and a lot of free African people of African descent had a lot of entrepreneurial success. They had a lot of social contact. There's a lot of intermarriage. There's clergy of different races and ethnicities, and the class structure was quite mixed. As white Americans started to settle in, many of the non-white workers lost their jobs, and many former slaves, especially and entrepreneurs, African American or African people of African descent who were entrepreneurs in New Orleans, left for Haiti. So this decrease in population of people of African descent early in the American takeover of New Orleans was kind of an out-migration of some people, mostly to Haiti, I believe. But then, of course, we're talking about the era of slavery. So the slow increase over time, or very slow, was due to the importation of more slaves from Africa into America in general, and then obviously into New Orleans. And then we see, a movement, and this movement trend is similar to other parts of America where African Americans kind of spread out more out of the South and into new areas that had booming economies. So between 1890 and 1952, formal direct institutional discrimination, called segregation, Jim Crow laws, was created and enforced, which solidified racialized neighborhoods in New Orleans even more. So by 1952, New Orleans was a very, very segregated city. In the 1920s, new levee construction created new real estate. So the levees freed up more land, dried it out, and that new land was mostly occupied by white residents. After World War II, a new highway system made it even easier for white New Orleans to live in the developing suburbs. So you see some white flight out of the lower line, even more white flight out of the lower lying areas of the city, which left a disproportionate number of poor residents who were of African descent in the city in poor neighborhoods because of official segregation, because of racism in the marketplace. Now, flood control in the city has been inadequate for two reasons. One is, as I mentioned before, the disappearance of the coastal wetlands. So as silt is redirected into the lake, means less silt is going out into the Gulf of Mexico, which means the existing wetlands are being eroded through storm surges and just natural tidal variation, which, as I mentioned, effectively makes New Orleans closer and closer and closer to the ocean. So for every 2 miles of wetland, or basically every 2 miles of wetlands, reduces storm surges by 16 inches, or 6 inches, sorry. So as the wetlands get reduced, the chances of, the storm surge gets basically higher. It doesn't dissipate, which means more water gets pounded against the levees and into the canals that are protecting New Orleans. Now, this disappearance or reduction in the wetlands in the Gulf of Mexico has also intensified, or it is made, basically what it does, it means that hurricanes, as they're approaching, don't slow down as much before they hit the city. So if you had 10 extra miles of wetlands, that's 10 extra miles for the hurricane to slow down. But because those wetlands are disappearing, hurricanes are slamming New Orleans with much more force. But that force is also putting more pressure on the levees that were constructed with physics that were predicting less powerful earthquakes, or earthquakes. What am I talking about? Less powerful hurricanes. So hurricanes are fueled by heat. Less land means more heat and more forceful storms, but also it means less chance for less land means less time to slow down those hurricanes before they hit the city. Now, so I mentioned the second thing here is that the levees protecting New Orleans are inadequate. They're prior to Katrina, they were last repaired and reinforced after a major hurricane in 1965. They were built to withstand a Category 3 storm, but years of neglect have weakened them substantially prior to Hurricane Katrina. The state and federal government knew about these major issues and did very little to address them. In fact, 80% of the federal money that was promised for wetlands restoration and levee upgrades for New Orleans was rescinded after 9/11. So after 9/11, the federal government basically clawed back 80% of the money that was promised to try to create basically a pipe system to take silt from the lake and then pump it into all the way over to the Gulf, the mouth of the Mississippi, to try to build up more wetlands. And there's still small scale projects that are doing that, but they and it's cost millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to do, but they can't pump in enough silt to withstand the erosion from the ocean, because the Mississippi, if it was left to its natural devices, would deliver a lot more silt than you can do through pipes. But that's another story. So because of the state and federal government's lack of funding and poor planning, and because of the legacy of racial segregation, poor African American residents in New Orleans, located in areas that were the most prone to flooding, were at a greater risk than other residents of being flooded out due to a major hurricane. Now, global warming makes hurricanes more frequent and more forceful, and the levees and the canals have reduced amount, as I mentioned, have reduced the amount of silt entering the Gulf of Mexico. Wetlands are washing away. So that's just an important part of the story here. Now, we can make comparisons between cities or between countries, because a lot of the disaster of Hurricane Katrina was just a lack of planning, a lack of foresight, which again, we saw that with the US's response to COVID. The U.S. does lots of other things good, so I'm not trying to be anti-American here. There's just a lack of planning for safety in that country for some reason. And partially it just is a lack of coordination. Too much is left to the states when things could be more federally organized. But anyway, so the population of some countries are more at risk of death from hurricane than the population of other countries. But even at the same level of exposure, some countries experience more hurricane-related deaths than others. Countries that experience fewer hurricane-related deaths tend to have systematic precautions, whereas countries that have higher numbers of hurricane-related deaths have fewer precautions. So it really just comes down to planning. So since the US and the US states do not plan very well for natural disasters, there's kind of a higher emphasis on individual accountability as opposed to community preparation. Its number of hurricane-related deaths is actually similar to many third world countries. But even some third world countries prevent more hurricane-related deaths at higher levels or risk of exposure than the US does. So we really see that this lack of preparation, this culture of individualism that expects individuals to plan for their own disasters and plan for their own relief or plan for their own safety doesn't seem to work out, right? And we'll talk about that more in a second. So a good example to look at is Cuba. So in 1963, Hurricane Flora killed over 1,100 people in Cuba. After that, Cubans began to take precautions. So Cuba has a civil defense network that coordinates rescues and evacuations. The Federation of Cuban Women organizes door-to-door canvassing and ensures that there's up-to-date lists of the elderly and folks with mobility restrictions. Right. So the point is that each community in Cuba, whether it's a village or a neighborhood, has people going door to door and making sure that they know who's going to need aid when there's an evacuation, who's going to, and they tell people about the evacuation plans, even if there's no imminent danger. Okay. Doctors and nurses evacuate with neighborhoods to ensure health care is available. This is really cool. So when there is an evacuation order in Cuba, people will know where to go, and and they'll have health care on the caravan out of, say, Havana, but also they'll have nurses and doctors at the evacuation sites, so everybody has health care in case something happens. Now, another interesting thing that Cubans do is they ensure that people are allowed to bring their pets and their valuable personal items with them. So a lot of people, when you evacuate, you're told you have to leave your pets behind or you have to leave your valuables behind, and people don't go, right? So in Cuba, they're like, well, bring your pets, bring your valuables, not your couch probably, or your refrigerator, but things that are meaningful to you that can't be replaced. That's more likely to increase the level of compliance. Evacuation routes and destinations are well known in advance, and temporary housing is well stocked with food and water, and sanitation is planned. So because of these precautions that started after 1963, only 22 Cubans have died during 10 major hurricanes between 1985 and 2004. When Hurricane Dennis hit in 2005, which was a Category 4, 1.5 million Cubans were evacuated, which is about 13% of the country's population, and 16 Cubans died. Okay, so it's basically just good planning. And this is not a country with a lot of resources, right? So it's a country with good communication, good planning, and Cuba has a really good history. Well, they have a bad history of being, a dictatorship and being an authoritarian regime, but they do have a lot of success in ensuring that volunteers in neighborhoods and in communities are organizing things. So during the early 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, there was a major food crisis in Cuba. And it was actually just people on the ground in their communities who started to grow their own food, having their own gardens, and sharing their food that actually got a lot of Cubans through that. So if we look at Katrina and the U.S. federal government and Louisiana's response to Katrina, a mandatory evacuation alert was called only 20 hours prior to the hurricane's estimated landfall. There was no clear plan for evacuation. As a result, it was almost impossible for everyone who wanted to leave New Orleans to actually leave. The exit routes were jammed with traffic and people abandoned their cars. The city knew that 100,000 residents did not have means of transportation. Most of those 100,000 were African Americans. The city tried to take over private buses like Greyhound to transport people, but by then the roads were impassable. There's just too much traffic that you couldn't actually leave. So during Katrina, about 80% of New Orleans flooded, and there's no clear plan for what to do after the flood. And this is why it was such a social disaster. So there's absolutely no plan. Now, part of the blame lies with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. So a 2001 FEMA report listed 3 of the most likely disasters to hit America: terrorist attacks in New York City, a major earthquake in San Francisco, and a severe hurricane hitting New Orleans. So even though they knew that a major hurricane hitting New Orleans was going to be a disaster, the very federal agency whose job it is to plan and mitigate disasters didn't do anything. Now, part of this is because most of the top FEMA officials, including Michael Brown, who was then during Katrina was head of the agency, were political appointees with no experience in emergency management. So this is a problem with the U.S. federal system. It is with our system too, where people who should have very specialized skills to hold leadership positions didn't. They were just political appointees. Now, FEMA itself was chronically underfunded, which is completely ridiculous given the need of funding emergency management agencies, especially after 9/11. So by 2007, which is 2 years after Katrina, the population of New Orleans remained at 2/3 its pre-Katrina level. Most of the damage occurred in poor Black neighborhoods, and these were the last places to be cleaned and rebuilt. White neighborhoods were cleaned and rebuilt first. White residents got their insurance settlements first. This means that, in effect, at least by 2010, New Orleans was whiter than it was prior to Katrina. So white residents returned, and African American residents, especially poor African American residents, were basically refugees. So many of them ended up in Texas, living in hotels funded by the federal government, but they had nothing to go back to for years. They lost all their property. They lost many of those houses were legacy houses. They're houses their grandparents or great grandparents would have owned. The houses themselves were absolutely destroyed. So they ended up losing connection to their past, and the funding to rebuild was very sparse in many ways. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers has been rebuilding and strengthening levees and improving the canal system, but the levees protecting richer, predominantly white neighborhoods are taller and stronger than those protecting traditionally Black neighborhoods. But the risk of flooding and surges remain greatest and greater around those Black neighborhoods. So we see that there's this legacy of formal segregation and then de facto segregation in New Orleans, and there is still, over 10 years later, an infrastructure that is placing African Americans, poor African Americans in particular, at greater risk of death from hurricanes. So for whatever reason, Louisiana, the city of New Orleans, and the federal government are not interested in addressing issues of environmental racism. These issues themselves are not unknown, right? So activists and scholars and sociologists even have been documenting the extent of environmental racism, racial inequality, both in the marketplace and in civil society for hundreds of years. And these agencies, whether it's federal government agencies or municipal agencies or state agencies are populated by people who make decisions, and they can't, in my opinion, claim that they don't understand how their decisions reproduce racism, especially environmental racism, or increase the chances of poor people dying in natural disasters, because all the literature, if they just were to look at it, and all the newscasts over the past 20 years, if they're able to watch it, tell us this is the case. Okay, so anyway, so this is an example, kind of an environmental history and sociology of New Orleans that shows that natural disasters are very often social disasters, but increasingly we need to look at how the human impact on the environment affects natural processes. So hurricanes becoming more forceful because of because of global warming, and because of the reduction in wetlands, because of the diversion of silt. Now, other things that are interesting about the Mississippi River is that it goes all the way up to Chicago. So around the same time that the levee and canal system in New Orleans was built or improved upon in the 1920s, Chicago, the American Corps of Engineers in Chicago, redirected the Chicago River to basically dump the city's waste into this other river. I can't remember the name right now, and that river flows into the Mississippi. So basically, they've redirected a river, pumped it full of human waste that would have flown into whatever lake is up there, Lake Michigan, I think. But instead, so basically they've redirected a river so it would flow not into its natural lake, but into the Mississippi. So some of that silt in the Gulf of Mexico is actually human waste from Chicago. Now, another interesting thing, which is increasingly a natural disaster, but it's a slow-moving one, is the incorporation of what's called the Asian carp into the Mississippi River system. So the Asian carp is actually 4 different types of carp. They're all edible. They're all super, super hardy, and they've outcompeted the natural fish in the Mississippi River system. So not necessarily just in the Mississippi, but the rivers that flow into the Mississippi. So now if you are in a boat going fishing for fish in any of those rivers, you're more likely to catch the Asian carp. And if you Google it, it's just incredible how many there are. So again, they are edible and they're nutritious, but it's an invasive species that has outcompeted the natural species and basically is eliminating and changing the ecosystem. When they were introduced, as I believe they were introduced to address algae blooms, probably in the 1950s. So there was well-meaning biologists thought, oh, if we put these fish in this river system, we'll take care of these algae blooms. The algae blooms themselves were probably created by just the dumping of raw human waste into the rivers. And Asian carp do a really good job of dealing with the algae, but they also do a really good job of eliminating indigenous species from those waterways. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. A little short half-hour lecture, and yeah, that's it.